Welcome back, Stanley. It was great to have you with us as we talk about free to serve, protecting religious freedom of faith based organizations. And so we're glad to have this book with us. And and your colleague, Stephen Monsma, have done a tremendous job. And you talk about how faith based organizations are able, in this current environment where it's a real struggle,
Yeah.
to be able to continue living the religious faith of the organization when everyone else is claiming that, in essence, what's happening is you're being discriminatory as you're involved in education, as you're involved in healthcare. And you have some suggestions. What are those suggestions to help faith based organizations in this current environment?
Yeah. So I'm thinking here about the U.S. context, and Canada is a little bit different, but I think there's some common principles. Um, so one of them is just legal. So our both of our countries and other Western democracies, and also by international treaty, do respect religious freedom. But religious freedom protects religion, religious entities, and so every organization that to get greater public appeal or more donations or to not irritate people has kind of successfully concealed its religious character is kind of in difficulty because it wants to be different and yet doesn't show that its difference is rooted in its faith. So, one thing we say to organizations is really go back and rethink what is it that they really believe, and is that why they do things in a particular way? Is that why they need the freedom to do them? Then they better connect their different practices with that faith so that the outside world can see that this is an issue of religious freedom and needs to be protected in that way. So, there's kind of a legal thing to do. But, of course, for a religious organization that wants to be a example of that faith, it should want to be kind of faith based in what it does anyway, just because it's a matter of faith. So, for reasons of legality or mission, it should really think about its faith convictions and how they're reflected in its policies and practices. But this is also important kind of for we could call it kind of the public apologetic. I think too many people look around in society and they see all these good things being done, and they don't realize that a significant proportion of it is done by people of faith exactly because of their faith, and that they serve in a way that's distinctive because of that faith. Instead, they just see a lot of good stuff happening, and so they think, well, that good stuff is happening. Here's another good thing that could happen. We could add a certain rule that says don't do X or Y, and they don't realize that that rule might conflict with the faith that's actually the reason why that organization is serving or serving in a particular way. So I think it's really incumbent on faith organizations to help the public understand that the good things that they see from this particular school or that charity, that agency of some kind, is really based in the faith of that organization. That's what draws people together. That's why they decided to do it. That's why they do it often with lower pay than people might get some other place. That's why they persevere. Often, a lot of these services were pioneered by faith organizations before the government ever thought there was anything that could be done. And sometimes these organizations take on the hardest cases because they have a real faith that God can transform anybody. So in the United States, often, prisoners coming out of prison, trying
Mm.
to figure out how to get back into life, it's religious organizations that say, hey, everybody has a second chance in, God's economy, and we want to extend that to you. And other people just think, hey, you were in prison, we can't trust you anymore. So
Mm.
for these organizations to uh, I think of it sometimes as being kind of lighthouses all around the country, that when you look out there, you'll see it's not just somebody doing good, not just an organization doing good. It's doing good because of its faith. That's what motivates it and drives it. And I think that would help the public understand that those good works are rooted in that faith, and you can't just pry them apart and still expect to have the good works be there. And then it's really interesting. We live in democracies, Barry. In democracies, legislatures, to do their job, have to listen to the organizations, the people they're regulating. But often faith organizations are fearful about speaking up because they see some opposition. They're worried that the politicians will be negative if they find out that it's an organization of faith. But if they are silent, then legislators have no way of knowing that what they're doing might really harm the very public good that they're trying to advance. And so how is it that organizations can gain a voice again to speak into the public policy making? And Institutional Religious Freedom Alliance, that's one thing we do, is give a way for groups to come together and not just feel like they're the lone voice speaking up, right? So they can do it with
Mhm.
others of other faiths. It'll be speaking up on behalf of faith, of faithful service, and not just your own self-interest. And so that's really important. But we've discovered in the United States, this just tells you how chilled things have gotten even here, that often organizations are just worried even about signing their name on a letter to the government, even though that's constitutionally protected right. And so legislators have said, we can even arrange for you to speak to us anonymously if you have to, but then tell us what's going to happen if we pass that law or if that regulation isn't changed, because we don't want to lose your services. We think they're really important. But, if people of faith don't speak up and say, what you're calling discrimination, really it's a different way of doing things, and here's the good that comes out of it, how would we expect people who don't believe in any of that to understand it and just make space for it? So I think in this moment it's really tempting to try to hide, but it's exactly the moment that organizations need to come forward and find
Mm.
ways to do that, and to kind of say what they're doing and why it's important and why it needs to be supported.
Okay, so I think that's an extremely important point. It's the idea of having the courage, as it
Yeah,
were, to be able to say, this is who we are, this is why we are doing what we do.
yeah, exactly.
Okay, very good. It strikes me that over and over, and I noticed here in the book, you have a number of guest authors on a couple of chapters there, at least three chapters, and then you've got some other another chapter where you got some others who have written. But I've noticed in particular this one situation in a university where the author Tish Warren quotes a vice chancellor who was upset that this Christian group wanted to have their leaders to be Christian,
Yeah, oddly enough.
which oddly enough, I know it's bizarre that you would even challenge that. But the vice chancellor replied, and this was down at Vanderbilt University, that they rejected the idea that you would have a statement of faith, and or the vice chancellor says that creedal discrimination is still discrimination.
Yeah,
So there's a real sense that all discrimination is a great evil. We have had a situation here in this country where it seems that even when there's discrimination that one would consider legal, in other words, there's an exemption in the human rights legislation, that the courts are saying, well, even that's wrong, or at least there's the implication that it's wrong. Um, how do we deal with this concept of discrimination?
yeah. So it's a real challenge, and partly because there actually is and certainly has been discrimination that is wrong, and that's part of the legacy of Canada and the United States. In the United States, we kind of from the very beginning had this racial discrimination, bringing people from Africa in chains and often dying on the way, and then when they got here, enslaved, breaking apart families and working people to death, and all that terrible thing. And then when we fought that bloody civil war. And then after that, instead of real liberation, still very negative things done to African Americans, including the Jim Crow laws that lasted into the early 60s. So, there has been just terrible discrimination. That's the worst of it, but other kinds as well. And so people rightly are sensitive to the term and the concept. And I think we ought to just say that's right. People often do terrible things to each other that they shouldn't do. So
Mm.
it's fine and even vital, I believe that as a Christian, to be against inappropriate discrimination. But we do discriminate in the sense of making choices all the time, and often it's great, it's necessary. Um, how could you educate people without saying this is good and that's bad and what you just tried? Uh, uh, how can you be a good professional unless somebody can come alongside you and say, well, what you just tried to do with that person, that didn't really help them very much. There's a different way to do it that's better. So you have to give
Mm.
up your way of doing it, adopt this other way, and then you'll actually be able to provide help. When I first encountered this kind of idea that is actually in the United States in Congress, in which there was a law that would have protected the ability of a faith organization to hire just people of the same faith if they thought that was important. And the legislator's assistant, the staff person, said to me, well, my boss really likes this proposed idea, except for that part about discriminating and hiring. How can you justify that? And so I asked her, I said, well, your boss runs a Republican Senate office, and how many Democrats do you hire for your office?
Right?
And she said, well, of course we can't hire Democrats because we're trying to do Republican kinds of things. And I said, of course that's true. But that's true then of a religious organization that because of its faith, for example, is pro-life, or it's willing to work with illegal immigrants, even if they're illegal, or
Yeah.
something else. It's Muslim and it's banking and it won't charge regular interest. Well, how can you do that unless your staff actually believes in those things? Uh, a colleague of mine who's a vegetarian, she was looking at websites the other day in the Washington, D.C. area. It turns out there's a vegan association national in the United States, and they require every single staff person to be vegan 100% of the time. Well, you could say that's discriminatory. Somebody else may believe in the cause, they want to work and support it, and so on. But just imagine here, the spokesperson for the Vegan Association is at a conference, and then after giving her presentation, she goes out and has a hamburger. Everybody's going to say, well, you
Yeah.
just told us this stuff as if it was true, but you obviously don't think it. You just say whatever you get paid to say. Why should I believe that? Well, that's a really good question. So, in fact, organizations need to have some coherence. They need to have people who really believe in what they're doing. And if that's what we permit, in other words, if we accept that the public is very diverse and have diverse institutions, then people will be able to actually be served in a way that's appropriate for them from out of this diversity of institutions. If we just say, oh, well, it's discriminatory, you can't do that, then it's just a very few people that are going to find services that are the way they would like them to be and find places of work that fit what they really believe. So I think we have to get rid of this very loose talk about discrimination, that it's all bad, that making distinctions is bad, and instead just admit that if you have a different point of view, it's going to be reflected in the way you operate. And many other people want to operate like that as well. And so let's let that be free to be like that. And of course, some kinds of discrimination, again, are just totally wrong, trying to rob somebody else of their rights. But it's possible for a same-sex married couple to be treated fairly and find all the services they need, and then a traditionally married couple to find all the services they need as well in our very diverse society, as long as we let it be diverse instead of, wiping out a lot of it by loose talk about discrimination.
And I think that's extremely important. There's so many people that are wanting everyone to say, okay, this is the true view, this is the right view. You must accept me, regardless of what your religious belief is. Well, listen, Stanley, I just want to thank you so very much for being willing to share with us about your recent book. It's hot off the press, Free to Serve, Protecting the Religious Freedom of Faith-Based Organizations. And I highly recommend it, even for those who are in Canada or even in other Western democracies. I think Australia, the UK, and so forth are struggling with these same issues.
Indeed.
And I think we need to continue the conversation because there seems to be a lot of opposition against faith based organizations. And I think you folks have put together a great primer and highly recommend it. And thank you again for your time.
Thanks so much, Barry. Really great to talk with you.
Okay, all the best.
Thanks.